councils are always called in, I guess, a spirit of reformation, here in a small r sense, of trying to make the necessary reforms that exist. There's a problem that's confronting the church. It's spiraled to being significant, and the bishops and local authorities want to address it once and for all, so it's cleared up, hopefully forever. That doesn't necessarily always work out.
Hey, my name is Matt Poole, and this is Unapologetically Catholic, the show where we talk about the different reasons that I personally am unapologetically Catholic and why I think that you should be too. This week, we have the first ever Unapologetically Catholic guest on the show. His name is DP, and he's with the Scriptorium project. We talk about all kinds of different things concerning church history and councils and all of these different, why they're important, a lot of different things, the split between the East and West. Anyways, they do some really great work, and I think it would be awesome if you would go check out his stuff. You can find him on Instagram at the Scriptorium project, and yeah, check out all the different works that he's translating. I think he's doing some really good work that could be very beneficial to the faith. So with that, let's get right into it.
So I've been running the Scriptorium project for quite a few years now. Essentially what it is a large library of documents at this point that are fairly important that have just been neglected for various reasons. So we're talking about documents that relate to the history of the church, to Western civilization, to folklore and the lives of saints, and things that are relatively pivotal to Western civilization that just haven't been touched. And some of that is neglect, and some of that is the language barrier. So my primary background is with Latin, and so many books in civilization, especially in the West, were kind of fundamentally rooted in Latin. To be literate in Latin was to be an educated person. Even here in the United States, the schools like Harvard and Yale required Latin and Greek as in their entrance exam. Otherwise you couldn't get in, which made sense because most of these books, which are published prior to the 1920s, are distinctively in that. It made sense for publishers, it made sense for academics. There's one language to be able to talk about everything. In a world where Latin isn't as significantly pronounced, we have all of these books that are just sitting around. Nobody's touching them, nobody's reading them. So trying to take this vast corpus of texts that really represent not only the church, but everything that's kind of gone into the great Western tradition, and making it accessible to people for the first time in almost a century, or in some cases, ever. That's the fundamental basis of what the Scriptorium project is about. And as it continues to grow in quantity of texts, I think it's starting to get some traction in terms of interest, because people now see it as this massive resource, especially people who are graduate students or interested in the history of the church and the whole intellectual tradition of Catholicism.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the big things that brought me, because I grew up a Protestant, and then part of my questioning and digging was kind of thinking, okay, well, what did a church service look like, or at the time saying, what did a church service look like in the year 800 or 500, or what did they talk about within the church in the year 200? And when I was a Protestant, I remember one day thinking, why did I never think about this before? This has never crossed my mind. Here I am 2,000 plus years later. There's a whole lot of history that I have no clue anything about. I knew about the last 500 years, because of the Reformation.
Yeah.
But before that, I always thought, where did we come from? So I think the work that you're doing, I think, is really neat, because I think, like you said, having these texts and having these documents and these different things that have never been translated into the English language before is important to have, just to kind of know our history. Like you said, not even of the church, but of Western civilization as a whole.
Yeah, sometimes it's difficult to be able to split those two, Because
Yeah.
even reading state documents from France or Germany or Scotland, the people who are writing them are ultimately clerics, right? They're clergy. That's even the origin of the term there. So there's not really any escaping it during the medieval period. The church is involved in every aspect of life, and especially when it comes to transcribing documents. The only reason that we know anything about the Dark Ages and the medieval period are some very, very dedicated monks.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a. I feel like I'm gonna learn a lot today. I'm happy you're here. But I know one thing that we definitely wanted to cover is some of the church councils. So, like I said,
Yeah.
I'm very big on telling people, hey, this is a forte of mine and this is where I excel. And then if I don't know, I'm just going to tell you I don't know. And that's why I want to have more people like you on, because you're more of an expert in this area, where I vaguely know what a church council is and I kind of, sort of know how they work and what their purpose is. With you doing the work of transcribing some of these different works that come from these different councils, I figured it'd be good to talk to you and really just ask to start off what is an ecumenical council? What's a council? What kind of weight do they hold?
Yeah. So, especially in the history of religion, the idea of a council is very specific. So in the ancient world, you don't see anything like this. There's not groups of, like Cappadocians or Egyptians getting together and talking about what their religion means. That's something that's very specific to Christianity. And what's more, we can go right back to the very beginning. In about the year 49, the first council is held in Jerusalem under James, the bishop of Jerusalem at the time. And there's this big question because they have the life of Christ, they have their understanding of his ministry. But what's the way forward? And so with this first meeting of the church, there's a sense of how do we address the question of Judaism? Do Christians need to be observant Jews as well? Which comes to dietary prescriptions like kosher, and it also comes to the question of circumcision, which obviously in the world of evangelism, the latter is going to be a big barrier for a lot of people converting. And that makes sense. And so eventually there's this debate that ensues with Peter and Paul and James, and they all come to the agreement that the Jewish law is not to be discarded, but it's not in effect. And that becomes the point of contact for all future church relationships, right? We still read the Old Testament, we understand it in the context of natural law, but we're not out looking to fulfill, I think it's something like 600 different mitzvahs that are contained in it. Our understanding of it is completely different. That becomes the basis of what would become future church councils. Sometimes the issue in the future is, the Council of Jerusalem is kind of an all-star team. You have all of the apostles there, the original members of the church. Everything else in contrast seems like a pickup team. There'll be future early church councils, which are sometimes called synods. They'll use the Greek word, which is intended to be like more of a local affair. So your local diocese today will still have synods. Famously right now there's the German Synodal Way, which is intended to be a collection of the bishops just in Germany. But this is just kind of what is expected initially for the first few centuries of the church. So they'll have synods in Caesarea and Bostra and places in Asia Minor. But with the legalization of Christianity, there's something afoot. There's the desire to be able to create a sense of unity within the church, and with its legalization, it's out there. If anyone has heard of an ecumenical council, they've probably heard of the First Council of Nicaea, which, to the frustration of every historian and theologian, was popularized by the Da Vinci Code. You heard the variety of claims that are made about that, where the Emperor Constantine comes in, says that this is the way that Christianity is going to be. That is not the function of the council.
Yeah, we should absolutely be getting our history from movies, right? It's that's the place to go.
So that one in particular tends to stick in a lot of historians' craw, because it's not really all that complicated. The events, they're publicly published. I mean, you don't really have to do that much in the age that we live in to be able to find out what exactly happened at the First Council of Nicaea. So the big issue at the time was this guy named Arius, who's relatively infamous in the passing centuries. He's claiming that Christ is not in equality with God, that he is of another substance, he is of another nature, and therefore he is somehow separate. The church is compiling itself together with something like 300 bishops, most of which are coming from the eastern half of the empire, to be able to discuss this point because they want this settled once and for all. This is the first instance where they were talking about the idea of orthodoxy, of correct teaching in the pure sense of the Greek word there. And they discuss orthodoxy and Arius' opinion. And famously, when Arius got up and said, verily there was a time when the Son of God was nither, that's when Santa Claus, St. Nicholas, famously got up and punched him in the face.
Yeah, yeah. Rightfully so, I think.
But there's this big question in the first centuries of the legalization of Christianity of, okay, Christ is God, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? Because the text of the Gospels and even the Pauline epistles, they're valuable, but they're not a textbook on theology. We have no explanation of exactly what that looks like. And so the fathers in Nicaea decided they needed to put something together, what we now call a creed, which is derived directly from the Latin credo, which means I believe. And this is a statement of faith, that they're going to define not only the Christian religion, but every religion after this. You have a definition of what it means to be within the confines of the church. And that's quite a revelation. Nobody's even attempted something like that before. Now, it's phrased with the clear intention of condemning Arius and his proposition that Christ is not God, that Christ is just a created creature like all of the rest of us. And you'd figure that would be straightforward enough. But Arianism would persist systematically for a few centuries because of political reasons, with the barbarian invasion, and still to some degree is still with us with certain, I don't even know if I can call them Protestant designations. So famously, the Unitarian Universalist world, and the Mormons all claim modern Arianism. So they're outside of the fold of that.
Yeah.
Because language kind of shifts over time, they had to have another meeting about 60 years later in the year 381, where they had to be able to discuss and define this a little bit more clearly, because there was some doubt to the language that was being used, mostly over the word prosopon in Greek, person, which I don't know the particular sociology of it, but the whole idea of personhood wasn't well understood in the ancient world, and even into late antiquity. So Christ is a person of the Trinity. What does that mean? So sometimes you'll see the Nicene Creed as the Nicene-Constantinople Creed. For that reason, it's just a question of clarity at that point.
Wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know there was a distinction there. So that's why sometimes you'll hear it just the Nicene Creed and sometimes the Nicene-Constantinople Creed. Is that?
Yeah.
Am I understanding that right?
And even the language that's used when you hear it. The intention there, God of true God, light of true light. Most people say it's white noise, especially for cradle Catholics. It doesn't mean anything, but the intention there is to clearly specify that Christ is in equality with the Father, which is, a phrasing that you'll find in the Gospel. It's not idiomatic in English as much, but in Syriac and Aramaic language, to be the son of something means to be in equality with or of the nature of. So a son of God means in equality or of the nature of God, son of David. Really, the only modern equivalent of that is when you call someone a son of a bitch.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Huh. That's interesting. Yeah, I think just listening through you, just hearing you talk, I can think back, and I remember even as when I was studying Catholicism and looking into the church, I remember thinking, okay, but there's, if these differences or these issues or these problems come up, there has to be something outside of, there has to be someone outside of scripture that gets to make these decisions. Even just like you said, just based off language alone, you
Yeah.
think what when scripture was being written over 2000 years ago, the New Testament was being written over 2000 years ago, or even say the Old Testament even well before that, the things that they have said then that now have been translated through a couple of different languages, I would assume would be the right way to say it, into English over these thousands of year periods. There has to be questions that are going to come up, and who gets to how do we know what's right? How do we know which way forward is?
Yeah. So the text of the New Testament is famously written in Greek, a type of Greek called koine. And it's always a challenge when dealing with the translation. But with dealing with Greek in particular, it's really difficult because a single word could have multiple meanings depending upon how it's declined and its context, which is a challenge in and of itself. But for things like the Gospel of John, the way that Christ speaks, no one in antiquity speaks like that. It's very particular. And knowing exactly how to interpret passages like that is challenging, to say the least. I mean, as someone who had gone through a particularly Catholic parochial school, I remember thinking, like, it should seem obvious what Christ is saying. Why do the apostles have such issues? But if you go to the text, it's not clear at all. He makes a lot of allusions. He makes statements about himself, like in the Gospel of John. Christ, anytime he speaks, he will say, "Imai ego." He uses these two verbs back to back. Again, no one talks like that. So why? There has to be some sense of a hidden meaning. And a lot of early theologians like Origen talk about it as the imai, the sense of being, the being one, similar to the how Yahweh is declined, the one who is, I am who am, which is certainly the interpretation put forward for it. But there's a lot of confusion if you don't go to the text, if you don't have people who are invested that just read the translation flatly, because there's so much potential for error in that. And so a lot of the function of the church and the magisterium in that is almost a certain quality control, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's why I think these councils that have been had all throughout history are all very important. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to say that almost every council that has come together has always been, there's some central theme or issue that's trying to be worked through or fixed, or a problem that arises. Is that a correct understanding, or what could be
Yeah.
the reasons they're called?
So councils are always called in, I guess, a spirit of reformation, here in a small r sense, of trying to make the necessary reforms that exist. There's a problem that's confronting the church. It's spiraled to being significant. And the bishops and local authorities want to address it once and for all, so it's cleared up, hopefully forever. That doesn't necessarily always work out. And sometimes they're small issues, and sometimes they're big issues. So with the question of the biblical canon, that was not addressed at the Council of Nicaea, or really at any ecumenical council before Trent in the 16th century. But it was St. Augustine in North Africa, at the Synod of Carthage and one at Hippo, that said, this is what the biblical canon is going to be, this is what we're going to read, and oh, by the way, part of our service is also going to include a sermon, which prior to that was not universal. So there's a certain standards that are kind of enacted, and sometimes other synods will pick up on that, and they'll have a meeting to say, yeah, like we agree with those guys. This is what we're going to institute.
Huh. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so the biblical canon is actually a really interesting point, and I think that's one that within both are mostly just Catholicism and Protestantism, I think has come up a lot. Mainly, there was the where Wesley Huff was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and with him being a biblical scholar. But even listening through that, and even in my own research in years past, I always thought, yeah, what are, how did we get the list of books? Because somebody has to be able to say, here's the list. These are the books that we consider as scriptural, and everything outside of this we don't. And I think it's really important to recognize that someone. I mean, if you look at church history, there's been varying lists from multiple different people. So again, I think it goes back to that question of how do we know who gets to make that call, and how do we know?
Yeah, and that's a difficult question because even though Augustine had made this declaration in North Africa, because it was a local synod and not an ecumenical council where the whole church is there and the whole church is present, there was still a lot of variance in terms of what they would find in the biblical canon. It wasn't until Luther that the church here in the West decided we need to be able to fix this. We need to be able to address these are the books that are going to be in our biblical canon, and there shouldn't be any ambiguity into it. Where prior to that there was some leeway. Even if you look into the Eastern Orthodox world, they'll have different books. They'll have more Psalms, extensions. They'll have like 3rd and 4th Maccabees. Okay. How much that variance is really going to matter is debatable. But distinctively, the Protestant canon as selected by Luther was done for specific reasons, most of which relate to what they call a soteriological question. How does salvation actually play out? And Luther famously is sola fide, through faith alone. He had some issues with some of the texts in what is sometimes called the Deuterocanon, and so rather than debating them or confronting them, he just cut them right out.
That's interesting because I have a friend of mine who he's actually a Protestant pastor, and one of the things he'll always ask me is, okay, what is it that are in these other books that you guys have that's wildly different from what how can I be led wrong not having these books? And I'm thinking, yeah, there's some really important themes and some really important ideas that are in those books that you don't have, that you might not necessarily be able to come to the same conclusion without having those books as a part of your canon.
Yeah, and that plays out in all kinds of different ways. Some minute, but sometimes in larger doctrinal ways.
Yeah. It's interesting stuff. But I know one of the things that you and I had talked about as well is the Council of Florence.
Yes.
So I think it'd be interesting to hear kind of what, because this is one of those areas where you kind of have some documents that you've translated into English. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay.
So I guess to bring things up to speed, there's 7 initial councils of the church. Really the heavy hitters here. For the most part, everyone agrees upon them. So the Roman Catholic Church does, the Eastern Orthodox Church does. Protestants will unofficially agree to it, so it doesn't have the weight, but clearly the questions of Trinitarianism and Christ's godness is just kind of implied. The issue is what directly follows that. So for a lot of the church's history, there was this standoffish relationship. So there's an emperor that's existing in Constantinople, and there's a bishop in Rome. These are the people who are calling the shots. When an ecumenical council is called, the emperor pays for it. He oversees it, but doesn't really do all that much. But ultimately, the rubber stamp of approval has to come from Rome. There's a tension that's kind of building up with this situation, because especially with Rome being outside of the purview of the Roman Empire, the Pope has more authority to do as he pleases outside of the jurisdiction of the empire. So this comes to a head in the 9th century when there's an issue with a guy named Photius, who is the Bishop of Constantinople. The emperor appoints him, the Pope says no. And so we automatically see a collision taking place between church and state. What results is an ecumenical council for the Catholic Church called Fourth Constantinople, where they try to sort out this issue, and Photius goes away for a while. But it's also really confusing, because in the Orthodox world, there's also a council, which they call ecumenical, also called Fourth Constantinople, where Photius is the good guy.
Oh, wow.
And this is the source of so much confusion. Even going into the Orthodox world. Because initially he's condemned and then he's brought back, both of which are at the time fine, but you can feel the friction that's developing between East and West. Eventually, the Roman emperor, the Byzantine emperor, tries to elevate the office of the Bishop of Constantinople, who we call the Ecumenical Patriarch now, to be a potential rival to Rome. And we see the seeds for the division between Church East and West, Catholic and Orthodox, kind of developing. This all comes to a head famously in 1054, where there's a mutual excommunication, and it's the first step towards these communion of churches breaking away from each other. They're not fully disunited yet, even with that excommunication in place. There's the recognition that they're not talking to each other, there's no communication. There's a drive early on to be able to amend this. So things like when the Roman Emperor calls upon Pope Urban to send him aid and issues in the First Crusade, that's an ecumenical move. It's a desire to bring both halves of the church together. It's one that would have eventually disastrous results because the armies of the Fourth Crusade missed their target. They didn't end up in Jerusalem. They got involved in a Byzantine civil war, overthrew the emperor, put a puppet in, and the Greeks even to this day are very angry about this, that a Latin government took over a bunch of what they would call Franks, took over the empire and essentially wrecked Constantinople. And after that point, the possibility of union slowly starts to fade away. And also the Ottoman Turks coming in from the east start to chip away at the empire until the 15th century, when the Roman Empire is basically the city of Constantinople and like a little bit of Greece. So that's the prologue for what's taking place in the council here. The second to last Roman emperor, John, says we need to do something. The enemy's literally at the gates. Let's try to fix the situation. And our best potential ally is talking to the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. And they want to work out an agreement, a reunion of churches based upon the idea of mutual respect and mutual aid. And if that really came to fruition, that would have been wonderful. It's just that the political undertones of what were happening at the time poisoned it from day one. And so some of the tension that still exists, because if you talk to the Orthodox world, they will definitively talk about the Council of Florence as being the breaking point. They don't want to deal with Rome. They don't want to deal with the Catholic Church as a whole. In short, there was a pact signed that said, yes, we can agree upon the theological differences that exist between us in terms of papal jurisdiction, in terms of purgatory, all of the things that still exist in terms of the separation between the Catholic and Orthodox Church. The ball was drawn up, signed, everybody went home. But when the Greeks went home, the locals were not happy about it. The Greek citizens themselves did not like the idea of connection with Rome. They did not like being tied to the Catholic Church. And there was a lot of bitterness and resentment. And so eventually, when the city did fall, they said that this was pointless. And the bull was revoked. There was no union. And we're still living that out, both in terms of our ecclesiastical, but also our political lives. Where when Pope John Paul went to Greece, I mean, there was active booing on the streets of Athens because the Greeks saw him as an alien or a potential aggressor against their pure Greek Orthodox faith.
Wow. Huh. That's interesting. So I didn't know. So yeah, that's I didn't know that the two halves of the church were really close to reuniting that early on. That's interesting.
Yeah, there was, I think there was probably a genuine interest on the part of the Latin half of the church, and with the hope of reunion. The Pope at the time, Eugenius IV, said, "Bring in the Armenians, bring in the Copts from Egypt, have envoys come from the Emperor of Ethiopia. The whole church is going to come back together, and we're going to be one unified item." And that was very ambitious, and there were documents that were drawn up and signed, but apparently trying to be able to heal some of these ancient wounds requires a little bit more than just a signature.
Yeah, yeah. I can imagine so. And it's interesting because it seems like this is something that Pope Francis is really interested in, is seeing a reunification of the two halves of the church, which I would love to see, even as a newer convert. I've been Catholic now 4 years, but even as a newer convert, I would love to see there being truly one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church that is,
Yeah.
there is no weird kind of divisions and separations, but we all truly are one. That would be great.
Yeah, it's a wonderful vision. It's just a challenge, somewhat historically, but also theologically. Usually, the big gripe of the Orthodox world is something called the filioque. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, loosely. I know enough about it to say yes, I know what you're talking about. But you probably know a lot more details than me, so feel free to share what you know.
So I mentioned the creed, right? The creed from Nicaea, drawn out. This is the way that the Christian religion is going to be defined, and orthodoxy. It was drawn up, and it was understood that if there's going to be any changes to the church, it has to be done through an ecumenical council. And that was easy enough. All of the bishops there to be able to discuss this and kind of work it out and vet it through its proper needs. The challenge is that when the barbarian invasion happened, trying to be able to stamp out the Arian heresy with them required the Pope and Latin bishops to add the phrase "and the Son" to the creed, which is what the Latin for filioque is. That doesn't make a large change in terms of the theological underpinnings of the creed, but the East was and still is fairly furious that the Pope acted in a unilateral way. Usually the defense of that in the Latin world is this is something that was absolutely necessary to make sure that we're teaching the right things to the right people, even if it's done outside of the jurisdiction of a council. To me, for what it's worth, this doesn't seem like a large issue. It seems like something that could be relatively easily amended if it required reasonable discussion. It's just that there's 1,000 years of bad blood that are there that stand as a potential barrier right now.
Yeah, yeah. That I'm sure that stuff. That's hard and that takes time. It's not something that's I'm sure is going to change overnight.
Yeah. But I think that there's been a significant spirit, a positive one, since the Second Vatican Council in terms of being able to actively engage with the rest of the Christian world. I mean, famously, the diction that was used from Vatican II shifted the Orthodox and the Protestants not from schismatics or heretics, but brothers and sisters in Christ.
Yeah.
That kind of language is a little bit more reconciliatory.
Right.
You're able to effectively engage with people who previously we just didn't talk to.
Yeah, it's a lot easier for someone to listen to you if you say, "Well, you're a separated brother or sister in Christ, not well, you're a schismatic and a heretic. You're probably
Yeah.
not going to get, warm reception when you call somebody that.
Just in, well, not even just my lifetime. Since that time, famously the mutual excommunication between Rome and Constantinople was dropped in the 60s
Hmm.
for the first time in 900 years, so which is a significant step forward.
Yeah.
And the Patriarch Bartholomew had attended, I want to say, the funeral for John Paul II back in
Okay.
2005.
Huh.
So there's growth there. My suspicion is that it's probably going to take quite a while to be able to heal some of those wounds.
Yeah. Yeah, and it seems like I'm not incredibly familiar with Eastern Orthodoxy, but from what I understand, it seems like some of the Eastern Orthodox churches are maybe a little bit closer than others. And I would assume that maybe some of that has to go back or would go back to some of that political problems that, happened in the past that still kind of have implications even today.
Yes. It varies. So within the West, there's the Roman Catholic Church, which is very uniform. Eastern churches exist as more of a confederation. So you've probably seen like Bulgarian Orthodox, Romanian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. They're all independent churches that are united together. And some of them have more frustration, more anger about this issue. Famously, in the Greek world, it's a point of nationalism to be associated with the Greek Orthodox Church, the Church of Greece, where there's a memory of this medieval humiliation that took place because of the Crusades, which is fading, but it's not fading quickly.
Yeah. Huh. That's interesting. Interesting. Well, so I wanted to ask you too. I guess what were maybe specifically in the Council of Florence, what were some of the things that they covered in particular, or what are some things, some implications even to today that have come from that council?
So, what the what the intention of the council was to be able to resolve the theological disputes that exist between East and West. The biggest one has to do with the primacy of Rome. So when the early ecumenical councils were happening, the understanding was this, that, there's bishops all across the empire and even outside of the empire, but we're all united into a single church. There's going to be 5 primary bishops that are going to be the most important. That's Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Just because they're very old, and those are very pivotal cities at the time. With the rise of Islam, 3 of those cities fall under foreign occupation. So Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Antioch are all under the Caliphate, which just leaves Rome and Constantinople. There's going to naturally be some division when there's only 2 players left. In the early church, it was understood that Rome was primary. It had primacy as being the first among equals. So the understanding was that the head of the church would be the Bishop of Rome. And even in the Orthodox Church, in their canon law to this day, that's what the document says, which is very confusing, especially for the 9 centuries where the Pope is considered to be an excommunicate. This is why talking about it gets a little murky, because even things like the official name of the Orthodox Church is the Orthodox Catholic Church. In terms of being able to resolve that, Orthodoxy's big gripe has been that not that the Pope deserves to be the head of the church, but that he doesn't have universal jurisdiction. He can't do anything anywhere. He is the head of the Latin Church, what up until Benedict was called Patriarch of the West, and that is his jurisdiction, but his brother patriarchs also have their own jurisdictions. He's just intended to be the arbitrator.
Okay, I see. That's interesting because so that makes a lot of sense now. Why, that they would just hearing you talk, it makes sense that a lot of times you'll hear people, Eastern Orthodox or Orthodox, say, well, there was no pope in the same way that you guys have today, where you have one guy who gets to more or less call the shots for all of the churches.
Yeah.
So they would claim, well, this is not how it's always been. This is something that happened, you know, it happened way after the churches started.
So
So
some of it is the complication that comes in with the course of history. So originally, yeah, there were subdivisions that were drawn up, but it was understood that any new group of people that were going to be converted would be under the auspices of Rome, which is not a problem when there's, Scandinavia and Ireland and Scotland, all of these far off places that have been untouched. But when the group of the Slavs came in, distinctively the Bulgars, they came in and they came right up against the Greek lands in Constantinople. And so the understanding was this is a new group of people. We're going to send our missionaries out and they're going to convert them and be under Rome's jurisdiction. And that was not welcome. So famously, the Greeks had decided that they were going to create their own missionary efforts. The famous brother saints, Saint Cyril and Methodius, who went out, converted the Slavs under the Greek Orthodox banner, and also gave them their language. Not in the spoken form, but the written form. Cyrillic is named after Saint Cyril.
okay, huh? Yeah, that's I think I had heard that. Maybe it was last year on his feast day. There was I saw some kind of video or something that had come out that I heard that, and I had no clue until then. So it's
Yeah.
really interesting.
So in the West, we hear February 14th. Everyone thinks automatically St. Valentine's Day or even Valentine's Day. But in the East, it's all about Cyril and Methodius. So they'll have big parades on February 14th, and they'll have letters from the Cyrillic alphabet written up.
Wow, huh? That's interesting. I didn't know that. That's really neat, man. Huh? Well, yeah. I guess we've talked a lot about the East and the West churches and kind of their division. So I guess in your, what do you think if there's a path forward to reunification? What do you think that looks like if you had to guess? I know that's a very that's a very difficult hypothetical question, but knowing the past and knowing the history and how all these things happened, there's got to be some kind of way forward. So,
So I think the best hope for reunion has to do with most people are unfamiliar with them in the Catholic world because 99% of the Catholic Church is the Roman Catholic Church. But there are also 27 other churches that exist in what's called the Eastern Catholic Churches. And these are effectively Orthodox churches that are in union with Rome that maintain their distinctive rites, their traditions. There's Armenian, Byzantine, East and West, Syriac, and probably one that I'm forgetting by accident here. Whoever that is, I'm sorry. But if there's going to be some extension of a union, it requires the Roman Curia to honor the distinctive traditions of the Eastern churches, allowing them to continue because they're just as ancient, they're just as apostolic. It requires them to be able to step off and allow some potential variance that exists. Because historically in the Latin Church, there's one rite. It has to be celebrated in a uniform way, which is valuable, but it also quashes some local flavor to the church. So in the Latin world, there used to be a Gallican rite, a rite specifically for the church in France. There was one specifically that was Celtic that existed in Scotland and Ireland well into the Dark Ages. One called the Mozarabic rite, which existed in Spain and North Africa. And even today, there's an Ambrosian rite in northern Italy, in Milan. Being able to accept some liturgical variance would be really valuable within the Western Church, distinctively the Latin Church. Trying to be able to change things in the East so that they'll be willing to even have those kinds of discussions is a little bit more complicated because there is a lot of distrust, and maybe even rightfully so. Trying to be able to recognize that a lot of the theological points that exist between East and West are relatively trivial here. The distinction in terms of our interpretation of purgatory, or some of the things that exist in terms of the variance in the calendars, are not enough to be able to substantiate a division like this. Yeah. Think distinctively of the gospel account in John 19 in particular, where Christ talks that we must all be as one, just as you and I, Father, are as one. The division that's existed historically within Christianity, going right up to its original legalization under Constantine, is a tragedy. There's so much that exists here, and people don't talk to each other. The intention of something like the Scriptorium project is so that groups of people who have essentially identical beliefs will be able to talk to each other after centuries. They'll be able to understand each other because these books are finally available and they can be understood, and there's finally mutual intelligibility that exists.
Yeah, that's great. That actually made me think. I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask you too is, there's sometimes people, I think maybe you could even say most Catholics will look at this and say, yeah, well, why is it important for me to read it? Like, why does it matter to me that I read documents from Florence or whatever ecumenical council or whatever various councils? So, what, I guess maybe you kind of answered the question already, but what other kind of value do you think there is to even the laity reading these documents and understanding these things that we haven't before?
So I guess let me go in a little bit more of a controversial direction here, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, with Protestants, they will say sola scriptura. This is the text of the scriptures, and that's all we need. We don't care about any of these traditions out there, which has a limited sense of value. Certainly being able to focus in on the primary text of Christianity is really important. But let's go into certain things, like usually in the Protestant world, they'll talk about the passage that exists in all the synoptic gospels about Christ's brothers and sisters. And they'll say, these are the blood children of Joseph and Mary after Jesus. And in the plain reading of the text, that would seem straightforward if you're only going with the biblical account. I know there's a lot of talk about cousins, but the Greek word that's put in there is oiadelphoi kai adelphei, brothers and sisters. The thing is, there is this vast library of texts that exists that give us more information about that. The first of which is a document called the Proto-Evangelium of James, written in the 2nd century, probably fairly early on, where it talks about, okay, there's James, the brother of Jesus, and yes, that is a brother, but it's not a full brother. What follows from all of those documents is this long account of Christ's brothers and sisters, who are said to be the children of Joseph from a previous marriage. And sometimes we get fantastic details about Christ's family life, things that we wouldn't have from the gospel accounts themselves. So St. Epiphanius writes this book called Panarion, and he names Christ's sisters. He calls them Mary and Salome. And there might be another sister in there, Anna. We can't quite tell. Just the same, the church father Justin Martyr talks about Christ's life, his occupation. He says that, yes, he's a carpenter, which is stated in the text of the gospel as a tekton, but he specifically works making plowshares. He works in the agricultural industry. We have this rich detail that begins to be able to color the gospel, to be able to give it the added elements that would not be fully understood, but we can only really understand it in the full light of history by going into these other sources. And that is a really complicated issue. When you just have the one book, the text of the Bible, it's straightforward. But when you have to do this advanced level of scholarship to be able to look at things, that becomes a little bit more complicated. That's a life of faith that's a little bit more devout. It requires more time and energy and consideration, and you have to struggle with things a little bit more because it's not simple or straightforward. I realize the question is, why should people be able to go into these things? What value does it have? And I just told you it'll make things really complicated. But I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
The simple life of faith where things are direct and straightforward and you don't have to think about it is not something that's valuable. I think that, particularly as I get older, the value of Socratic reasoning and the method and that Socratic wisdom is really valuable. To recognize our own limitations here, but to ask why, to ask the question of what do we really know and how do we know it. And that requires a lot of time and energy and struggle, and in this case, reading.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, that's good. And it's interesting that you talk about you said that these other documents kind of help color in the Gospels a little bit more.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that even as a Protestant, I can remember anytime, I would read the Bible or there would be some kind of like a Wednesday night Bible study or something. One of the big things they always pushed was, okay, you need to know the context, you need to know the culture, you need to know the time and kind of what was going on surrounding this writing and why was it being written. And I think that some of the things that you guys are interpreting and making available in the English language kind of help shed some light, not just in the time of that Scripture was written, but even all throughout history of, okay, well, it's important to know the context and it's important to know what was happening and what was going on so that you can then have a fuller, better understanding of the gospel or Christendom or even Western civilization, as we know it today.
Yeah. I think the biblical text is important, and there's certainly whole universities and programs that are entirely dedicated to the study of the biblical text. And while it's the primary document of Christianity, there's a lot of other ones there as well, where if we're only focusing on that one, we're missing a large part of the picture here. Usually Catholicism talks about tradition and being fundamentally rooted in tradition. This is what that tradition means. These are all of the things that are associated with it.
Yeah. Nice. Well, cool. Well, good. Those are really all the questions I had for me. But if you have anything else of value to share, please feel free. Like I said, I'm more than happy to admit when I don't know things, and I feel like I've learned a lot in the time talking to you. So I definitely appreciate you coming on. I know for those who are watching or listening, I feel so bad because you asked me to come on a long time ago, and I kept kicking the can down the road. I always joke that I will be 30 in March.
Yeah.
So I'm relatively young, but when it comes to like setting up, virtual meetings, I am like an 85-year-old man. If anybody's 85 listening to this, I apologize, but I think I finally got it figured out. So I'm really happy that you came on, and I'm glad that you were patient with me. So
yeah, it's great.
I appreciate it.
I love talking about these things. There's a certain breadth of knowledge where it's really hard to be able to simplify it to a certain point because there's just a lot I want to say. Thank you for bearing with me for some things.